Shalom, shalom, friends. Welcome to this episode of The Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times. Of course, this has been a very, very long time coming. It has been, I think, 2 months, if I'm not mistaken, since the last time I was actually live doing Watchdogs. And of course, Watchdogs themselves have recently been, moved over to this new channel and all that. So there's been all those differences there. It looks like it's been about 1 month to the day um, since the last time I actually had one of these. So nonetheless, definitely happy to be breaking the, what would you call that, hiatus with you guys. Definitely happy to be here discussing everything. There's a lot to discuss. I was supposed to be on yesterday, but unfortunately things do happen, and now I am here today. So yeah, a couple things that I want to address. Sorry, I'm trying to get everything set up here. I don't actually have my camera as well as my microphone plugged in, so I'm currently using everything that is on the laptop itself. I do hope quality sounds all right and all that kind of stuff. Really worried, but nonetheless. So, shalom. Thank you. For those of you who are here, please do like, please do share, please get this out to the different social media platforms that you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? And yeah, I hope you guys are happy to be here with us. We got a lot of interesting articles. Some of it's going to be recap because it's stuff that we have already talked about in the past. And some of it is going to be some new stuff, obviously, because new stuff has occurred in the last month. So we don't really have pre-article discussion for today. I have some things that are going on in my apologetics life, if you will, but it has no relation to what goes on here. No real announcements or anything like that, though, as far as that stuff is concerned. The channel's really just trying to get itself built back up, right? And so that's kind of where we're at the moment. Do have some good articles, though, for sure. And by the way, I see Slam RN is in the live chat. Shalom, sister. Thank you for being here with us today. With me today, I should say. I'm still in the habit of using the we, even though I haven't had co-hosts and a team in over a year. But, habits are hard to break, I suppose. Anyways, a lot of interesting articles today. So we have claims of election fraud in Israel. We're also going to be obviously going on with, we're going to be discussing a lot of stuff that's going on with the Israeli election in general. Obviously, there are some predictions I made that turned out to be false, turned out to not come to pass. So we're going to discuss a little bit about that, see why they didn't come to pass. Was it that I misjudged? Did we completely miss something? Is there some change of events that took place that caused everything to be a little bit different? We'll definitely get into a lot of that. Also have discussion about what's going on in Canada, which is huge. Obviously, we're all firmly aware of a lot of the stuff going on in Canada as far as their persecutions of Christian leaders. Another thing going on in Canada, though, is also the discovery of about 215 dead Indigenous children buried in and around a state school that I believe was associated with the Catholic Church. And it was I don't know for a fact if they were associated with Catholics or not, but they were associated with some church. And they actually were, using this as a means of converting the populace to not only Christianity, but also to, being quote unquote civilized, as far as being English speaking, being all that other kind of stuff, right? So we'll be talking a lot about that. And there really won't be much else besides Israel and Canada for today. That's kind of the topics we have for today. But nonetheless, just something I wanted to. Sorry, I got distracted by a comment here. So Slam asking, built back up, what happened? So actually, all that happened is twofold. The first thing is I moved this show, my Watchdogs, over to its own unique political channel. The show was already viewed less than my apologetics content. However, now it is viewed significantly less, as my other channel has 480 subscribers. This one currently has 28. And of course, that's perfectly fine, right? Everybody who wanted to leave that channel to come watch this stuff or wanted to watch both, they can do that. And anybody who doesn't want to do both obviously doesn't have to. But that was the main reason for why I was not actually able to, or why I've had to rebuild some stuff here, right? It's just trying to get a lot of that viewership back. But nonetheless, the other thing is just this long hiatus, right? It's been almost a month. Tomorrow it'll be a month, and since I did my last show, and that's definitely not a good thing when it comes to trying to build up a reputation amongst people for being a newscaster and all that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, we have a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. I'm going to go ahead and grab my coffee, get to the screen share, and we're going to get on the road, so to speak, here. Just one moment, friends. All right, so we are going to start today by discussing some Israel news, specifically Israel election news. For those of you who watch this show frequently, Israel elections and just things in general in regards to the Middle East are one of the biggest and most frequent topics that we try to discuss on this channel. And the reason being that, of course, it is very important information, not only to the way our geopolitical structure is set up, but also for us as Christians, understanding that there is a lot of prophetic as well as pseudo-prophetic elements at play in Israeli politics and in Middle Eastern politics in general. And so I like to frequently make sure that we are aware of everything that's going on there. Now, Netanyahu is recently making claims of election fraud because here's a fun fact for you. Netanyahu has actually been ousted from the premiership in Israel. Lost my train of thought there. He was seemingly about to set up a government. He had the Ra'am Islamist Party, as well as United Torah Judaism, as well as his own Likud. As well as numerous other parties from across the political spectrum being willing to accept him and to accept his new setup of governments here in the name of trying to basically stave off yet another election. They were going to have a fifth election. If you guys remember, we were discussing that in May, talking about how a fifth election could be right around the corner. And then all of a sudden, it appeared that Netanyahu was going to set up this new government and that they were going to avoid a third election. But then all of a sudden, again, the government completely fell apart, not leading to a fifth election, but leading to a completely different Netanyahu-less government. A government where Netanyahu will be rendered still leader of the Likud, but only rendered leader of the opposition, as they call it in Israel. And if you think about our Senate Minority Whip, or that's the House Minority Whip, or Senate Minority Leader, either of those two positions, very similar to what the leader of the opposition in Israel is. Basically the leader of the opposing government or not government, but those who are in the government who oppose the current status government, right? That's considered opposition in Knesset politics, and Netanyahu will be taking their leadership position. But he has been forced out of the premiership. By the way, shalom, Antonio. Shalom, brother Nicholas. That's not the updated overlay. Huh. I could have sworn I had that saved onto my... I guess I'm not really paying attention to my screen. But I suppose you are right, aren't you? Huh. I didn't even realize that. I'll have to go back into our emails and resave that then. I thought I saved the new overlay. Anyways, we'll certainly fix that by tomorrow. I'll have another episode on for you guys tomorrow, by the way. But yeah, so that's what's going down, right? The election has set up a new government that is primarily made up of centrists, you could say. But it is made up kind of like Netanyahu's original government was going to be, of a lot of different groups, actually. And it's kind of it's a strange coalition, I'll be honest with you, because you have groups that are very, very radical in their leftism. You have groups that are very, very radical in their wanting to set up a sort of a halakhic state, which would be a lot like in Israeli Saudi Arabia. You have Islamists, you have progressive environmentalists, you have socialists, you have right-wing center politicians and left-wing center politicians, and all these different groups are making up the same government, right? And personally, I do think it's probably going to end up being a pretty big problem. I don't know that the 36th government of Israel will actually be able to function, considering the mass differentiation of opinion that exists within their ranks. I know I don't have my screen shared just yet, but I want to give you guys a list of the parties that are making up this new coalition. So we have one party called Yesh Atid. Now I'll go through what all these different groups believe very briefly so that you guys will understand what they're about. Yesh Atid is a centrist party founded by Yair Lapid, who will actually be the prime minister in about a year and a half. He's got an alternating premiership with Naftali Bennett, who we'll get to in a second, but Naftali Bennett is going to be the next prime minister. Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's group, is about, in ideology, liberalism, secularism, anti-clericalism, and the two-state solution. Okay, so what does that mean? Liberalism meaning kind of like your classical liberal idea. Basically support for ideas like consent of the governed and equality under the law, things that we wouldn't necessarily disagree with, of course, and not a bad thing there. Secularism, obviously don't need to explain that one. Removing religious iconography or influence from civic affairs. Anti-clericalism. This one's the real big one. They're actually very, very much opposed to the rabbinate in Israel. They're very much opposed to the Orthodox Jews in Israel. And they very much want to see the state not just secular, but secular in the Western sense, where secularization almost takes on almost a state religiosity of its own. And then, of course, two-state solution is the solution that tries to establish both a Palestine and a Israel. So that is one of the groups of this government. Who is another group we have in this government? We have blue and white. You guys might remember blue and white from previous Israeli elections. This is Benny Gantz's party, the one that was last year seemingly going to take over the whole government and then just completely and totally fell apart. They are considered to be centrist and liberal, but they're big tent. Big tent means that they try not to teach a whole lot about ideology so that they can get a lot of people to vote for them. They're typically unity parties. Benny Gantz's blue and white is definitely an example of a unity party. Their ideology, for example, they believe in Zionism and liberalism, which virtually all Israelis are going to believe both in Zionism and liberalism, meaning the classical liberalism. They do have social liberalism as well, such as being pro-gay marriage, pro-homosexuality, or excuse me, abortion, and so on and so forth. But for the most part, Benny Gantz, blue and white, is a big tent, as they call it, right? And that is another one of the groups that is going to be involved in this government. So you have Yesh Atid, you have blue and white, you have Yamina. Yamina is a right-wing political party, a pretty far to the right-wing political party. I don't disagree with them. I'm just being honest. They are, of course, Zionists. They also believe in what you would call national conservatism. National conservatism is precisely as it sounds, a nationalist version of conservatism. Naftali Bennett is Yamina's leader, and Naftali Bennett is going to actually be the next prime minister of Israel. Yamina is really big on nationality. They're really big on unity of the land. But it is important to note that Yamina has given up on unity of the land, at least for the time being, so that they can have this unity government. You're already seeing some of the cracks there, right? Unity of the land means no two-state solution, by the way. It means a one-state solution. They're really big on sovereignty, which is, of course, is a big deal in Israel, considering the fact that other governments, namely the United States, Great Britain, and the UN, seem to have a whole bunch of say as to what goes on in the state of Israel. The Labor Party is next. Labor Party is a socialist party. They are not hardcore socialist like Joseph Stalin. They would be more American-style socialist Bernie Sanders. Thing is, Bernie Sanders-style socialist always leads to Joseph Stalin-style socialist, so it's not like they're trustworthy. But nonetheless, that's another group. Notice what you already have here. I'm not done, by the way. Notice what you already have here in this government. You have a big tent party. You have a liberal party that is more akin to our Democratic Party. You have a right-wing party that is farther to the right than most parties we have at all. You have a socialist party. Your next one is going to be Yisrael Beitenu, which is another secularist nationalist party. Then you have New Hope. For those of you who may remember Gideon Sa'ar, that would be his political party. They are considered to be national liberal, which is nationalism and liberalism. So yet another voice here. Then you have Meretz. Meretz is a left-wing social democratic and green political party. Not making that up. And then you have the United Arab List, which we commonly know as Ra'am, which is not just an Arab majority party, but an Islamist party. So you have Islamists, you have revisionist Zionists, which is what you call the hardcore right-wing Zionists. You have progressive environmentalists. You have socialists. You have big tent. You have center-right. You have center-left. And all these groups are supposed to be part of the same government. Now, obviously, you can see where I think there's going to be problems here. But nonetheless, that is what you currently have. Now, with that being said, there is an awful lot of claims about election fraud going on here. Now, whether or not that's actually true, I don't personally believe that it is. Somewhat unpopular opinion for a Christian conservative in the United States to hold. However, I think Netanyahu kinda is a crook, actually. I don't think he always was. I think, unfortunately, as tends to happen to all human beings, Benjamin Netanyahu's not special, but you keep power for a long period of time, and eventually power corrupts you. Eventually, you start to become something of a pariah, even among those who used to support you. Um, and the reason is because you start to do whatever it is that you feel like, right? In the case of Benjamin Netanyahu, Netanyahu has arrested left wing Israelis and even left wing Jews who are trying to get Israeli citizenship. He has revoked citizenship of left wing Israelis. He has tried his damnedest to support the ultra Orthodox, who continue to persecute Karaite Jews and Messianic Jews, who continue to persecute Ethiopian Jews on purely racial levels, who continue to abuse even the rest of Israel by proxy through things like being exempt from the military draft, or such as not being able to recognize conservative or reform marriages, right? And Netanyahu's done this to himself, frankly. Now Netanyahu is losing, and he's losing that power, right? And he's losing that prestige. And he's probably going to, now that he's not going to be the prime minister, he's probably going to be charged finally with bribery and actually taken to court about it. Corruption and all these different charges that they're trying to bring against him. I think he will be found guilty. I think he probably did it also. I don't think it's actually something that, they're trying to like throw out against him unnecessarily or unjustly. However, now to save face, it appears that he is trying to claim election fraud. But with all that, we certainly want to get into the article here today. So let's go ahead and read this. Oh, come on. They got ads here that they just have to throw right in my face. But we'll go ahead and read. This is from Reuters, a article originally from Jeffrey Haller. Go ahead and give you guys the title here. Heller, excuse me. Jeffrey Heller. And I guess there's another person here who I did not realize, Mayan Lubell. So credit to both of them. Netanyahu out, Bennett in, as Israel marks the end of an era. And the end of an era, it absolutely and most definitely is. Real briefly, before we actually get to reading this article, I would like to let you guys know. Benjamin Netanyahu was the prime minister of Israel from 1996 to 1999 and from 2009 to 2021. So this person has been leader of Israel for a very, very long time. He's actually the longest ruling leader of Israel in modern Israeli history, both consecutively with those 12 years and in total with his 15. I think it's a very interesting thing, but nonetheless, on June the 13th, it was official that he was sworn out. Naftali Bennett has been sworn in. And, of course, the era has ended. Netanyahu has, Netanyahu has led Israel for the past 12 years. The Knesset is set to vote in a new coalition government, which at this point in time has already taken place, but at the time that this article was written had not. High-tech millionaire Bennett, namely Naftali Bennett, set to replace Bibi as prime minister, and the new government is expected to focus on domestic issues. Jerusalem, June 13th, and of course, 2021. Benjamin Netanyahu's record 12-year run as Israel's prime minister ended on Sunday with a parliament approving a new government change led by nationalist Naftali Bennett an improbable scenario few Israelis could have once imagined. By the way, it is important to note at this point in time that there were prophecies claiming that Netanyahu would be the final prime minister of Israel before the eschaton. Now, of course, he has the possibility of being elected again. However, if he is never elected again, then it would appear that that particular prophecy was false. Now, of course, when it comes to modern prophecies, we should always take them with a grain of salt. They're not coming strictly from Scripture. They are coming from people who are claiming to receive a word from the Lord. But with that being said, just figured I would point that out. But the razor thin 60 to 59 vote of confidence in a coalition of left-wing, centrist, right-wing, and Arab parties with little in common except a desire to unseat Netanyahu only underscored its likely fragility. And of course, that is a very, very important point because, as I was just pointing out to you guys, these people don't have anything in common at all. Lapid and Bennett are so diametrically opposed to each other as to be basically the equivalent of having Trump and Bernie Sanders in the same coalition government, right? To give you an idea, not that their policies are identical to those two, but just to give you an idea of how different these guys actually are from what you might consider the norm, or from each other, really, is the big point, right? And already you're seeing a whole bunch of compromise from the parties. For example, Naftali Bennett is huge on the one-state solution. He's huge on annexing the West Bank, so-called West Bank, Judea and Samaria. He is huge on annexing Gaza. He is huge on removing foreign influences in the Israeli government, all things that I agree with, by the way. But he's decided he's going to put all of those things aside for a year and a half in the prime minister's seat and the opportunity to unseat Benjamin Netanyahu. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to form this coalition government, right? So your whole reason for existing as a party and as a politician, you gave up on so that you could become the prime minister. And that's just one example. Do you think anybody's going to let Ra'am, an Islamist party, set up an Islamist-style state in Israel or start to pass Islamist laws? I highly doubt it. What about environmentalism, right? What about setting up a new green government? Now, of course, this could go the exact opposite direction, which is actually a great deal more terrifying in my own opinion. It could be that this coalition government has made a good number of backroom deals, right, of in-the-dark handshakes between X, Y, and Z, and that they actually are going to try and cobble together all of these different ideologies and agendas into one grotesque hydra of a government. That could certainly happen, and if it does, it will absolutely need to be spearheaded by a strong man, which I'm sure Naftali Bennett could absolutely be. Nonetheless, in Tel Aviv, thousands turned out to welcome the result after 4 inconclusive years, or elections rather, in 2 years. Hope, anger, and defiance greet birth of Israel's new government is what this tweet here says. There has certainly been a lot of that. Excuse me. I'm going to drink my coffee here real quick. All right. Excuse me. Excuse me again. Thought coffee would help with that. Turned out it did not. Anyways, quote, I am celebrating the end of an era in Israel. End quote, said Erez, excuse me, Ben Zanir in Rabin Square. Excuse me, quote, we want to succeed and to unite us again. We want them to succeed and to unite us. Again, excuse me. End quote. He added, as a flag waving supporters, as flag waving supporters of the new government sang and danced around him. Excuse me. But a combative Netanyahu, 71, said he would be back sooner than expected. If we are destined to go into the opposition, we will do so with our heads held high until we can topple it, end quote. He told Parliament before Bennett was sworn in. The new government largely plans to avoid sweeping moves, which of course is one of those two scenarios I was telling you about, namely the former, on hot-button international issues such as policy towards the Palestinians, and instead focus on domestic reforms. Palestinians were unmoved by the change of administration, predicting that Bennett, a former defense chief who advocates annexing part of the West Bank, so-called, of course, would pursue the same right-wing agenda as Likud party leader Netanyahu. And of course he could. If he does, he will be shooting himself in the foot, as the majority of his government is going to be disagreeing with him. He'll absolutely be causing a fifth election if he does that. My opinion, of course, right? Under the coalition deal, Bennett, a 49-year-old Orthodox Jew and high-tech millionaire, will be replaced as prime minister in 2023, about a year and a half from now, actually. So about January 2023. By centrist Yair Lapid. He's not a centrist. He is certainly left, but they consider him to be left center. But nonetheless, a popular former television host. With his far right-wing Yamina party winning only 6 of Parliament's 120 seats in the last election, Bennett's ascension to the premiership is a political jaw-dropper. Let me say that again in case you guys think you just entered the twilight zone. With his far-right Yamina party winning only 6 of Parliament's 120 seats, it's actually called a Knesset, but whatever, in the last election, Bennett's ascension to the premiership was a political jaw-dropper. And how? 5% of the legislative government in Israel is controlled by his party. 5 measly percent. And this man is the most powerful man in the state of Israel. This man is the prime minister, the head of state for all intents and purposes. It's technically the president, but the president doesn't do anything. And the head of government, the commander-in-chief, again, for all intents and purposes, because technically that's the president of Israel, but that's a ceremonial position. The man who, as Netanyahu has just shown, does have the potential to get dictatory. Not quite calling Netanyahu a dictator, but to get close, right? That position was just given to a man who won 5% of the legislative body. 5%. I mean, tell me that's not an amazing fact of history, my friends. How amazing would it be, in a kind of terrifying way, if the president of the United States after 2020 had won 5% of the Electoral College? Imagine 5%. What is that? It was just 538, I think, votes in the Electoral College, if I'm not mistaken. And so let's see, what's 5% of 538? 25. What? 26 and a half, something like that. So we'll round up to 27. Imagine a guy won 27 electoral votes, 5% of the popular vote, got elected the president of the United States. That's basically what we just saw happen in Israel. 6 measly seats out of 120. 5%. That's it. This dude's now the leader of Israel. That's obvious. I mean, if I was an Israeli, which I'm not, of course, but if I was, I would have a really, really big problem with that. Frankly, I almost think there should be a rule, and of course, again, not my country, but I almost personally would prefer some kind of a rule if I lived in a parliamentary system where you have to get at least a third to be elected the prime minister. And even that is pushing it, right? That's still a pretty low minority, in my opinion. But I understand in parliamentary systems, it's almost impossible to get a government or to get a single party to win 50% of the vote. I get that. But nonetheless, this man is now the leader of Israel. Interrupted by nonstop shouts of liar and shame from Netanyahu loyalists in parliament, Bennett thanked the former prime minister for his lengthy and achievement-filled service, which is true, by the way. Despite the fact that Netanyahu is leaving it somewhat in disgrace because of his bribery charges and because of his corruption and because of his persecution of his own fellow Jewish people, it is still very important to note that Benjamin Netanyahu is absolutely and undoubtedly the single greatest prime minister in Israel's history. Unfortunately, those two things do tend to go hand in hand. Those of us who are students of history will recognize, for example, that Abraham Lincoln was quite a vile tyrant at certain points in his time, leading the largest, or being the president during the largest state execution in federal government history, opening a concentration camp, arresting people without trial and keeping them in prison indefinitely, violating habeas corpus, which is the idea that the police and the military are to be separate. I mean, etc. Right? Lincoln did a lot of terrible, terrible, terrible things. And yet, you couldn't deny that Lincoln is the great emancipator, or that he basically almost single-handedly kept the Union together, as well as his own family. I mean, it's quite amazing the personal struggles that Abraham Lincoln had to go through during his time as president. What's the point? The point is that great men tend to also be corrupt and evil men. It's not always, but a lot of times they are one and the same. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't oppose the corruption. It doesn't even mean you shouldn't oppose the person. It does mean that, we should recognize Netanyahu's achievements, right? The Iron Dome, for example, is a spectacular achievement, an achievement that has rendered Israel virtually indestructible, right? Now, of course, virtually. They're not literally indestructible, but you see, you get my point, right? Obviously, the Abraham Accords and pushing forward with peace in the Middle East. I have a lot of opinions on those things, and you guys are firmly aware of a lot of my opinions on those things. But let's just be honest about one thing here. It is obviously positive for the Israeli people to make peace with their neighbors. It's also completely and totally unprecedented, right? Nobody thought that this was going to occur, with the exception of conspiracy theorists and prophecy nuts. And I say that tongue in cheek because I'm both of those things. I'm not actually calling you guys nuts. But you get the idea, right? We were the only people who cared even in the slightest, or thought even in the slightest, that there was going to be peace in the Middle East. Netanyahu, along with President Donald Trump, and a few Arab leaders as well, give credit where credit is due, has managed to move us towards achieving that. That's obviously, that's huge, right? He's beaten the Palestinian people into a virtual pulp, to the point where they will never again, in my personal view, recover to the point of being able to present some level of strong opposition to Israel, unless they have a UN mandated state. Now, I do think they'll probably get a UN mandated state. So in the end, we will probably see that occur. But I do have a feeling that it's going to come with a good deal of asterisks. And if it doesn't happen, meaning the UN and other Western powers do not force Israel's hand in establishing this Palestinian state, I don't think Palestine will ever recover from what Israel has done to it, right? Which is obviously a positive thing for Israelis, right? Let's recall the Palestinian people, quote unquote, are committing vile acts of terrorism regularly, and people always want to say, okay, well, what's a stone in a Molotov cocktail compared to guns and rockets and bombs? And my response to that is, frankly, it's not anybody's fault but your own that you're bad at war. Maybe stop starting it and you won't get bombed. But I mean, I don't mean to be rude, but like, you're bad at fighting, and then you want to go start fights. I feel like that's your problem. It's not anybody else's problem. Anyways, the point just is Netanyahu has a very, very storied career. And despite some of the more vile aspects of what he's done, we should respect that. But little love has been lost between the two men. Bennett once served as Netanyahu's chief of staff and had a rocky relationship with him as defense minister. Although they are both right-wingers, Bennett spurned Netanyahu's call after the March 23rd election to join him. And that may, in fact, be the key difference between the Netanyahu-led government and the coalition government that we currently have, is Bennett and Bennett himself. He may have single-handedly completely destroyed. Because remember, if you guys recall, those who were watching in May, we actually had reports talking about how Netanyahu himself was going to set up a coalition government. And it was a pretty scary-looking coalition government, right? They were going to have some of the groups that were already on there, like Yamina and Ra'am, meaning Islamists as well as secular nationalists. But they were also going to set up representation for, of course, the ultra-Orthodox, including the anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox, which means they were going to have a coalition of all of the most radical wings of the religious elements in Israel. That could have been, of course, very, very dangerous, and I even thought that it was going to happen, which we'll get to some of my predictions in a moment, because they did turn out to be incorrect. We had this, we didn't have a fifth election at all, right? We instead had this last-second coalition, and the person who I thought would be president dropped out before the presidential election. So we do need to talk about that stuff for sure. But if you recall, big part of the reason why I had predicted what I did is because Netanyahu was also going to set up a pretty dangerous coalition government. But nonetheless, congratulations from Biden. U.S. President and semi-sapient bowl of pudding Joe Biden. I obviously added that, my apologies. Congratulated Bennett and Lapid, saying he looked forward to strengthening the close and enduring relationship between the two countries. Quote, my administration is fully committed to working with the new Israeli government to advance security, stability, and peace for Israelis, Palestinians, and people throughout the broader region, end quote, Biden said in a statement. Netanyahu, widely known as Bibi, was Israel's longest-serving leader, serving as prime minister from 2009 after a first term from 1996 to 1999, meaning that he was, for 15 total years, prime minister, 12 years in consecutive, and of course, he may even come back. We'll see what happens. The most dominant Israeli politician of his generation, and arguably of modern Israeli history, though Menachem Begin and David Ben-Gurion might have something to say about that. He had become the face of Israel on the international stage with his polished English and booming baritone voice. He used his global stature to resist calls for Palestinian statehood, describing it as a danger to Israel's security, which is true. Instead, he sought to bypass the Palestinian issue by forging diplomatic deals with regional Arab states on the back of shared fears of Iran. But he was a divisive figure at home and abroad, weakened by repeated failure to clinch a decisive election victory and by an ongoing corruption trial in which he is denied any wrongdoing. His opponents have long reviled what they see as Netanyahu's divisive rhetoric, underhanded political tactics, and subjection of state interests to his own political survival. He hoped to prevail on the back of Israel's world-beating COVID-19 vaccination rollout, but was dogged by opponents who called him crime minister and accused him of earlier mishandling of the coronavirus crisis and its economic fallout. Business ahead. Addressing Parliament, Bennett echoed Netanyahu's call for the United States not to return to the 2015 nuclear pact between Iran and world powers, a deal abrogated by Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump. Even though Biden has said he's going to return, and indeed has even made some steps towards returning to that deal. Quote, renewal of the nuclear agreement with Iran is a mistake, an error that would grant legitimization to one of the darkest and violent probably means most violent regimes in the world, end quote. Bennett said, quote, Israel will not allow Iran to equip itself with nuclear weapons, end quote. Now, here's the funny thing about that. They totally will. They totally will, because Israel is actually owned by the United States government. I know that a lot of people don't like that I say this. A lot of people take issue with the fact that I say this, but here's the thing. Giving Israel a check every single year of something like $30 billion, or however much it ends up being, effectively turns the Israeli state into a junkie, a client state that does whatever we want it to do and does not do whatever we don't want it to do. Don't believe me? Go check out the 1980s attack on Iranian nuclear facilities and what Ronald Reagan had to say about it. And then check out Menachem Begin. Nobody's been more far-right and Israeli nationalist than Menachem Begin. Check out his response, his sniveling, cowardly, invertebrate response to Ronald Reagan for having the audacity to defend himself, right? To defend his nation. He took the initiative to defend his nation. Ronald Reagan had a problem with it, and he collapsed in front of this man. Why? Because he needs that check, because the Israeli government is a junkie, my friends. And by the way, this is what is plenty of Israeli politicians have pointed out before. Naftali Bennett, in fact, has pointed this out before. Meir Kahane has pointed this out before. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Yehuda Glick used to point this out. Menachem Begin used to point this out, and interestingly enough, he completely collapsed, right? I think Bennett will collapse, considering Bennett has already collapsed on numerous different things. But in this particular thing, he's saying, no, we're not going to let Iran get nuclear weapons. We're not going to let Iran. We're not going to let Iran. We're not going to let Iran. Really, you're not. I would love to see you try to rebel against Papa State in the United States of America. I would love to see it. I don't think you will. I don't think you will. Now, obviously, if there was a strong, godly, patriotic prime minister in Israel, then that person might. Somebody like a Meir Kahane. They might, right? But Naftali Bennett, sorry, not going to happen. Iran will get a nuclear weapon if they don't have one already, and that's just going to be the way it is. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people, like, we live in this fantasy world where we're going to prevent Iran from getting nuclear bombs without actually doing anything aggressive towards them. That ain't how it works. They're either going to get the nuclear bomb or they're going to go to war with Israel. One of the two. And by the way, either way, they're going to go to war with Israel. That's just an inevitability. Okay. But nonetheless, thanking Biden for his years of commitment to Israel's security and for standing by Israel during fighting with Hamas militants in Gaza last month, even though he just basically kind of sat on his hands, but whatever. Bennett said his government would pursue good relations with U.S. Democrats and Republicans alike. At home, Bennett argued, has angered right-wingers. However, by breaking a campaign pledge in joining forces with Lapid, having to fend off allegations from Netanyahu that he defrauded the electorate. Bennett cited the national interest, arguing that a fifth election would have been a disaster for Israel. Both Bennett and Lapid have said they want to bridge political divides and unite Israelis. But the new cabinet, which met for the first time late on Sunday, faces huge foreign security and financial challenges. Iran, a fragile ceasefire with Palestinian militants in Gaza, a war crimes probe by the International Criminal Court, and post-pandemic economic recovery. Bennett listed as priorities reforms in education, health, cutting red tape to grow businesses, and lowering housing costs. And of course, we'll see if any of that ends up happening. Coalition leaders have said it would pass a 2-year budget to help stabilize the country's finances. And thus endeth the article. Now, let's get to some of my predictions real quick, because I thought we would get a fifth election. I thought we would have a setup of this coalition government that was going to include anti-Zionists, as well as Haredi, as well as Islamists. Turned out to not be the case. I also thought we were going to see Yehuda Glick elected president of Israel. Turned out to not be the case. So, what happened? Why did I turn out to be so utterly and totally wrong? Well, there's a couple things that I seemingly had neglected to notice. The first was just how strong the anti-Netanyahu sentiment in Israel actually was. It's very, very, very powerful in that country. In fact, if we go to a Wikipedia article I have up here and look at the election itself, right, not necessarily looking at the parties, but just looking at the results. One of the things you'll notice here, Likud, 30 seats. That's it, right? I mean, that's less than a third. I think that's exactly 1/4. Yeah, 25% of the power here. And actually, if you look at their vote percentage, they only got 24.19. So really less than 25% of Israelis actually wanted them to be in power. They lost 7 seats. Obviously, that's a big deal, right? They lost the election for president. Isaac Herzog was actually elected president. He is, I believe, a member of the Labor Party. There's no unity in those who are opposed to Netanyahu, but most of the country is thoroughly opposed to Netanyahu. And I neglected, really, if I'm being honest, to give credit to just how strongly they disliked this politician, just how strongly they wished to see him removed, both the elites of the nation as well as the populace of the nation. And so that's the first thing I neglected in my predictions. The second thing that happened in my predictions here was I think I got a little bit too gung-ho in believing we were about to see the fruition of prophetic elements, right? Because what we were seeing in this unity government was unity between the different sects of Judaism with secular Jews with Muslims. And then we were also having in the potential election of Yehuda Glick a rabbi, the first rabbi who would be elected president, as well as an American, the first American to be elected president, as well as a Temple Mount advocate who wanted to set up a temple parallel to the Dome of the Rock, right? And that in conjunction with mass Catholic takeover in the United States, with mass election fraud all throughout the world, with the coronavirus, with United Nations increasing its power, with everything going on with the WCC, with Pope Francis doing all the stuff that he does, right? There was just so many things going on that it seemed to me that this was a moment in history, right? The Abraham Accords, the prayer at all of this stuff going on seemed to me like this was going to be a moment, right? Where the dam burst, so to speak, and in Israel we saw what would be essentially one of the most massive things that we had ever seen, right? In unity between Muslim, Jew, and secular Hebrew, as well as the establishment of a third temple in Israel. That obviously will happen. I believe prophecy is true. We're certainly going to see these things occur. However, my belief that this was going to be that moment may have kind of muddled my judgment a little bit when it came to actually looking at the situation on the ground. And then, of course, there was just the fact that this happened basically out of nowhere. I mean, nobody could have expected or predicted, rather, the coalition government that formed in Israel in June, right? But I do want to eat crow and take my negative credit where it is due. I think those are the reasons why the predictions ended up falling through, and I hope to do better for you guys in the future. I will say this much. I don't think that because this did not end up coming to fruition in 2021, I don't think that means it will never come to fruition at all. In fact, I think the exact opposite is true. I think it absolutely has to come to fruition, because I believe it is biblical prophecy. It is scriptural, right? Um, the Bible doesn't outright declare Muslim will unite with Jew. That's not how they say it, right? Obviously, Islam did not exist at the time that some of this stuff was being prophesied. But the Bible does prophesy religious and political unity that begins in the state of Israel. So I think we will live to see that. I think it's going to happen right around the corner. One thing that's important to note, right? We saw Bernie Sanders lose the election in 2016. And of course, he did again in 2020. But he didn't really lose in 2020, right? Because he ended up making such a massive impact on the Democratic Party in 2016 that by the time he ran in 2020, the only way to actually stop him was for the Democratic Party to become him. And now Biden, who just 2 years ago really was a moderate leftist, all things considered, is now way farther to the left than he himself has ever been, than Barack Obama ever was, than Hillary Clinton ever was, right? So on and so forth. In other words, really, Bernie Sanders did, from an ideological standpoint, win that election. I have a suspicion that we might see the same thing in 2021 in regards to the Israeli election. I have a suspicion that the idea of religious coalition and the idea of setting up the Temple Mount movement as men in authority is going to be so powerful after this moment that even if Bennett and Lapid do end up keeping power or passing power to someone else who is not involved with this group, even if that ends up being the case, I still do think that they will have such an impact on Israeli society that they will end up, in effect, ideologically winning this election. And of course, we'll see if that ends up occurring. I do believe that there is too many pieces in play at the moment for nothing to happen, for this just to be we were wrong, turns out, it's not going to work out that way at all. I don't buy that personally. I think there's too much huge, monumental happenings in the world for this particular election cycle to end this uneventfully. But that said, major plot twist, major diversion from what was expected, at least by me, right? Y'all heard it here plenty of times, the predictions that I had about what was going to happen in 2021. And they completely, I will admit, right, they pulverized. They completely fell apart. Yehuda Glick dropped out of the Israeli election out of nowhere, being the leader in the election and then all of a sudden he was leading the election, and then within a month, he was at the bottom rung and dropping out. I have no idea what happened there. I mean, politics is politics. Things happen, right? And then, of course, this spontaneous anti-Netanyahu coalition occurring. But like I said, things happen. Obviously, if you guys were in the business of looking for a profit, you'd be watching, one of them frauds like Mark Taylor or something like that. But you're not in the business of wanting a fraud. You're in the business of wanting somebody giving their honest commentary. So I hope you guys are forgiving at my wrongness, and I hope you guys do still see what I'm talking about, because I think that we should look at this the way we looked at, or the way that history will look at, I should say, Bernie Sanders 2016, not as just an all-around loss, because there's just too many big things going on. The Temple movement is too strong. The Levitical priesthood is already set up. The two-state solution is too big. The Abraham Accords are too set in stone. There's just no way we don't get something akin to the coalition government that we were talking about, right? Even if it is only in spirit, much like what we had with Sanders. But Who knows? I could totally end up being wrong about that too, right? That's the great thing about doing political commentaries is really God knows. Only God knows. And as Christians, it's great that we're conservatives. It's great that we might be patriotic. I consider myself to be somewhat of a nationalist. Um, all of these different ideological things are great. However, the best part about politics, which is also the best part about science and theology and philosophy and every other academic discipline you can get in. The best part about them is that God knows and we do not, right? That's the single best part about it. Why is that the single best part about it? Well, number one, reminds us all to be humble. Number two, it lets us know that we are actually living under the watchful eye of somebody who has control over the situation. And number three, it just, kind of puts us in our place, right? We could, everything that we say here could be complete and total hogwash, and everything that we say here could be straight up revelation from the Lord, right? But it's His world, it's His political system. It's it is funny because we often say, Satan is the god of this world, and we talk about the world system, and even I was just talking with Brother Nicholas and Jamie about how in Daniel 2 you have this statue, and the statue is representative of the world system, right? And all that's true. Don't get me wrong, but I think what we often forget is this is still God's world. That is still God's system. God may have given that system over to the devil's power or over to man's power, if you prefer. But it still belongs to him, right? The devil is useless. Can't do anything without the express permission of God. And neither can you and I. Neither can you and I. Nothing is outside of his will. Nothing is outside of his watchful eye. And I think remembering that will always not only let us know to be humble in the face of these different things, but also to be faithful in the face of these different things, even when we have things coming completely out of nowhere. Completely out of nowhere. Now, that said, we've already hit the hour mark. So I'm going to talk about everything else that I wanted to talk about tomorrow. So we'll go ahead and do that. That'll be a bunch of, basically tomorrow will be a really Canada-centric episode. Timothy's here. Shalom, brother. Good to see you. And Antonio as well. Shalom. Good to see you as well. Slam says no such thing as a left-wing center. Yeah, technically, what they mean by left-wing center is your what we would call moderate Democrats, which is seemingly becoming a rare thing. But your Hillary Clintons, your Joe Bidens of 5 years ago, right? But I would absolutely agree with you that the idea that those people are moderate is kind of comical, or that they're center, right? The only reason they're considered to be center is because the whole planet has gone left wing. But nonetheless, shalom to you guys. Good to see you here. So we'll talk a lot about Canada tomorrow. We're going to talk a lot about the indigenous kids. We're going to talk about the persecution of Christians. We're going to talk about sellout Christian groups. And it's all going to have to do with our good friends up in Canada. So hope you guys are interested in that. I hope you liked this episode, coming back after a long hiatus. If you did, please like and share, and also consider subscribing if you have not done so. This is a political channel where you will only get political events. So it's going to be, for example, this political podcast, The Watchdog, as well as any sort of a political open room I may want to have, political debates, political anything, right? It's all going to be on this channel, none of it on the other channel. So if you watch both channels, subscribe to this one for political content. If you don't watch both channels, I do have a Christian apologetics channel if you're interested in that. That's the Synagogue with no news, so just the Synagogue. Please consider checking that out. Antonio says, when is the stream going to be? Tomorrow, I believe I work in the morning, so probably closer to around 4 p.m., 5 p.m. my time. I'll have it posted tonight. So, excuse me one second. Sorry, I had a little bit of a loogie issue. Not that you guys care. I will post it tonight because I'm going to work tonight. And so I'll be able to see my schedule. And then while I'm on my break, I'll actually set up the stream for tomorrow. But Antonio, look around 4 p.m. Mountain Time. That's what I'm shooting for. I try to do these in the mornings, but unfortunately, I just won't be able to tomorrow, being that I'm working in the morning. Okay, thanks. Good stream, by the way. Thank you. I appreciate that. And absolutely, I appreciate you watching here. I know I see you frequently on both my channels, actually, so I appreciate you being a frequent contributor. And actually, so far, most of the people who are contributing their view time to this channel are also, excuse me, contributing their view time to my other channel. So I appreciate you guys greatly. Being cross-channel fans, I appreciate it a lot. Makes the work worth it. But nonetheless, yeah, we'll be back tomorrow about 4 p.m. Mountain Time, maybe 5 p.m. Mountain Time, but no later than 5 p.m. And I'll make sure that we have it scheduled and set up today so that you guys can set reminders and all that kind of stuff. Because obviously, I was going to do an episode yesterday, I didn't because of a whole bunch of garbage, and I just can't let garbage get in the way, right? I mean, it's that simple. If I'm going to be doing these things, if I want to make a career out of being an apologist, being a political pundit, being a historian, being all these different things, then I need to actually, provide you guys with the product that you are not, obviously only some of you guys are Patreon, but you are paying in a way, right? You're paying with your time. So nonetheless, appreciate you guys being patient with me. We will be back tomorrow at that time. If you liked this, please consider liking, please consider sharing, please consider subscribing if you have not done so. And of course, check out my religious channel if you have not seen it. If you like the content, you also can give to the Patreon, which is just going to be the synagogue on Patreon. I'll actually go ahead and drop a link in the live chat in case anyone's interested in that. Now, with that being said, I do want to stress people, please, please, please only give to the Patreon if you feel that I deserve it. But if you do feel that I deserve it, please feel free to give. I only stress that simply because I do want to make this a career. And while I love this country and I love the fact that people can make anything of themselves, I also do very much loathe the oversaturation of bogus nonsense in both apologetics and punditry. So if I've earned it, if I'm going to elevate it, please do consider helping me make this a career. But if I'm just presenting neutrality and or muddling the waters even further, then obviously don't even consider. And with all of that being said, I do have a question for you. In the face of Armageddon, will you compromise